Hey YouTube, my name is John and welcome to my channel. I'm going to assume that you're either interested in learning how to build a retro PC or you found my title mildly amusing and would like to know more. So after spending a significant amount of time searching YouTube, there's nothing that really covers the basics of how to build a retro gaming PC. Oh sure, there's all kinds of content that show folks building, things like case modding or upgrading or liquid cooling or whatever. But if you're completely new to the concept and want to learn how to build, there aren't a lot of videos out there that do this, and the ones that are out there do nothing but leave a lot of unanswered questions you may have. So my series is designed specifically for the absolute beginner and will cover the basics of what needs to get done to piece together a system, how to get it built, how to get an operating system installed, loading up and playing that first game. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, we're back. We got our first motherboard sitting in front of us here. This is a AT style socket 7 motherboard, probably vintage 1995-96. So I started building PCs around the end of 1995 when the original Pentium was in its infancy. There was nothing it couldn't run from the standpoint of DOS, and most of the Windows 95-98 games that were out for it would probably run, at least in that era. As they got later in, obviously got a little slower, but from the standpoint of the initial part, it ran most of the different things it was supposed to run. So the good news about this board, and most of the boards you're going to find on places to shop, I use mainly eBay for my parts, is that there's a plethora of these type of boards. Now these boards have pluses and minuses. This board is considered a baby AT style board. The reason for that is because of the fact that it doesn't have any of the ATX advantages that the Pentium 2 introduced when it was released. It has, as you can see, it has just a single soldered 5-pin keyboard socket here, and the rest of everything else, as far as input output was concerned in the board, came in the form of cables that were attached to headers on the board. As you can see, I can play right here. This is a 1x6 header. This is for the mouse. And there are two 2x5 headers. These are both for the serial ports. There's a 2x13 header here for the printer. Now, the way these work mainly is you would find the cables that came with them. Something like this. This would be an input-output serial port for a mouse. So the way it would work is every one of these boards had a pin 1, and it's identified in the board by a little white arrow, usually pointing to pin 1. Then in the cable, if you look at the cable, it's got a red stripe down one side of it, which also indicates pin 1. So the way it would work is you would take this cable and you would plug it directly into the header, just like that. Then this would get mounted into the case, and you would plug into it a serial mouse, which would again give you a mouse. Most of the boards that you see on eBay, unfortunately, are all usually ripped out of other machines, and oftentimes, more times than not, what you will get on sale is just the board, which is fine because usually aftermarket parts like this parallel port here, this serial port, you can usually find, and you usually work with the board. But oftentimes, like with this board, you do get strangenesses where the manufacturer didn't pin it normally. They use their own system for electronics and so on and so forth, and as a result, you'd find this this crazy setup where no matter how many of these aftermarket serial ports you buy and plug into the ports and then on the board, nothing happens, or into the headers rather, nothing happens. You get nothing. And it's maddening, but that's partially because of the fact that when the person who originally took this motherboard out of the piece, out of the machine it was in, the case it was in, they should have pulled all the cables that came with it originally. So who knows, like in this board, whatever happened to the original cables, because when I got the board, it was like, this is what I got. I tried many of these to get to mouse working, and I was never ever successful. And I tried DOS, Windows, Linux, nothing mattered. This is probably pinned differently than the way it's supposed to be pinned, and as a result, it doesn't work. So that's the first thing to know about how the AT boards worked versus, like, say, an ATX board. Now, everything else, for the most part, is pretty much the same. As you go along, you got 2 6-pin ports here. This is for power. This board is unique in that it has one PC66 SRAM slot, which is unique. Most of them didn't have SRAM. Most of them just had the standard 72-pin SIM EDO RAM slots here. This one has 4 of them. And then the rest of this stuff is just pretty much the same. You've got your 2 IDE ports, mainly for like your hard drive and your CD-ROM. There's a port here for your floppy, 40-pin port for your floppy. This port has 4 PCI slots and 4 ISA slots, mainly for your maybe network card, your video for sure, maybe your audio, but most of the time when it comes to DOS, your audio is going to come in an ISA slot instead. Then with the rest of it, it's all pretty much the same as other boards. You got your button cell battery here that keeps your time and date and any settings that you set in your BIOS straight, so when you power your machine off, you don't lose the settings. They're all stored because of this battery here. This is a socket 7 board, so this socket here is considered what they call a ZIF socket, stands for zero insertion force, and this socket here is mainly just for socket 7 Pentiums. And then this board has what they call, see, in the new boards, the new processors, they all have their cache built into the processor, but in the single core days of the Pentiums and the original AMDs, the external cache was actually on the motherboard itself. So this board, I believe, has 256 meg of cache on the board itself, and then this slot here is actually for what they call a coast module, stands for cache in a stick, that you could plug into this and give yourself an additional 512K of cache if needed. Aside from that, the only other thing about these boards that you should be aware of is these pinouts here at the bottom. These are all to hook into your let's say your lights for your hard drive and your power, other things like your speaker, obviously, because a lot of the DOS machines use the PC speaker to give sound. They didn't even use the sound card. And reset. There's a couple other ones, but those are the most important ones there. And this is pretty much what your standard baby AT board looked like. Now, if you go shopping on eBay, you'll find that most of these boards, most of the socket 7 boards you'll find look just like this. They're mostly all baby AT style boards. They're kind of a pain to install in a case. And the other catch is the fact that you have to have an AT case when you go to use them. So, for instance, this board would never fit into an ATX style case because it's not designed for it. The screw holes don't line up, and the keyboard port, because it's just one single solitary soldered keyboard port in the back, is not going to go anywhere in an ATX style case. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Your ATX style cases really were designed specifically just for a type of power, or board layout rather. This is what an ATX case would look like. So if you look at the back here, this here is exactly what the normal back of an ATX style board looks like, right? You got your mouse, keyboard. On this one has USB ports, and then the ports I was talking about that came in the form of cables are soldered to the board. So there's your parallel port for your printer, your 2 serial ports, right? And then this one has a sound card built in and a joystick header. Also, this case, but as you can see, this case would never allow for a board like this to be inserted into it. As you can see, because I'll lower this a little here. This one single circular port is all you have to go on the back of this, and the rest of this stuff would never line up with this board anyway. In addition to which, as you can see, if you look at the way the case is lined up, the board would never line up. Your PCI slots and your ISA slots would be off, and it would just be a mess. So what these boards require are an AT style case, and this is where it starts getting kind of bizarre, because AT style cases are difficult to find, and they're usually very expensive when you do find them. This is your standard AT style case. If you look at the back of this case, you can see, let me fix the camera here. You can see there's your keyboard for the keyboard port and the motherboard, and then all your other cables and whatnot for the board, like the COM ports we talked about, or your printer port, or your PS2 for your mouse port. Any of those extra ports are either on cards, or sometimes they actually have them. They would actually take them off the cards and they put them into these holes here. So they take the way it would work is they would they take this guy here and they unscrew these two pins, these two screws right here. This whole part would come out of the back of this bracket, and then they would actually put it into this hole here from the back, and then put these screws in from the front, tighten it down, and there it goes, just like that. And that would choose for both your serial ports, or your serial ports, your COM ports, printer, whatever. This one has them mounted on brackets, but I can show you the inside of the case. This is a kind of a nightmare, and this is where I talked about how the cables are a mess. This one, as you can see here, we've got all kinds of, here's all your cables right here for all your ports right here, and it's a mess trying to get all that stuff situated. But this is the only kind of case that a board like this will fit into. So when you go shopping and looking for a board, if this is the only kind of board you can find, your choices are either to buy a case like this, or try to find a case like this, or you can just use like oftentimes many of us, what we used to do long ago was you just used to use the top of a motherboard box, or even they even have open air cases. We call them like for test stations now. You can actually throw a motherboard onto it, put a power supply below it. It's got two tiers. It's really kind of nicely set up for that kind of thing, and it sort of kind of works for these boards. It's not perfect because they're even kind of designed for ATX, but it does work. Now this is one style, but like I said, this is the most common style board you are going to find on a PC, a socket 7. You go searching, like just do a standard search on eBay for socket 7 motherboard. Most of the time you're going to find these AT boards. Which is too bad, because like I said, they stopped making cases ages ago, and people who do have them will not let go of them. They will take them to the grave because they're so rare these days. So there's your one style of case right there, or board and case right there. Now the other style you can try to find are ATX style socket 7 motherboards. Believe it or not, they do make them. They were made mainly by OEMs. They look more like this, but as you can see, oops, I got this wrong. This is the way this looked right here. This was the back of it, and this pretty much looked just like a standard ATX, like a Pentium 2 board, only it housed a standard socket 7 processor, just like that. The rest of these were all set up pretty intelligently from the standpoint of where you're going to plug things into. There are very few headers in the board you'd worry about plugging anything into, and if you did, it was usually optional because all of your input output was right there. So that's in a way, makes things a lot easier. The problem is trying to find boards like this is very tricky. You have to look for basically an ATX style socket 7 board. And they're tricky to find. But if you look at the back of this board and you compare it to a case like this is actually the same board that's in this case right now. Everything lines up the way you would expect it to, right? So here's all your stuff. It slides right into the case, no problem. And most of the time, I didn't get with these two boards, but most of the time you'll get like an I/O plate that goes with the cover of this, and it covers all this empty space. If you can. If you can't, it's not a big deal. But that's pretty much in a nutshell how these worked. So there are your two different styles of boards you're going to look at when you get into building a retro PC.